The deafening, synchronized metallic clack of 40 heavy pulse rifles cocking loudly echoed across the dead silence of the central plaza. Standing completely unbothered in the absolute center of the lethal kill zone was a 3-year-old girl. She stared directly up at the towering, heavily armored Alpha King of the Vethkai pack and calmly informed him of a catastrophic diplomatic violation. According to subsection 4 of the Border Treaty, the tiny girl stated, her high voice possessed the terrifying precision of a master negotiator. Concealing a royal heir is a direct, undeniable act of war. The elite Solmare execution squad aggressively shifted their heavy red crosshairs directly onto her small, fragile chest. Exactly 60 seconds. That was absolutely all the time remaining before the corrupt High Counselor ordered the squad to completely obliterate the tiny political liability on the toned cold stone standing on the cold cobblestone. Imagine discovering that the brilliant, faceless administrator who flawlessly ended a brutal 3-year war also secretly birthed your only royal heir, and her child is currently standing directly in the crosshairs of a treasonous empire. If you absolutely love fiercely protective mothers and explosive, undeniable royal secrets, take a deep breath and hit that subscribe button right now to join a pack that never surrenders. The digital countdown on the heavy sniper scopes rapidly dropped to 30 seconds. High Counselor Thorne stood on the elevated marble balcony, his weathered face twisted into vicious, panicked sneer, his pale hand slowly rising into the air to issue the lethal command. The massive Alpha King, Kalen, narrowed his glowing crimson eyes, completely paralyzed by the impossible, breathtaking truth standing exactly 3 feet away from his heavy combat boots. The biting, sub-zero wind aggressively whipped through the massive iron barricades of the central plaza, violently carrying the heavy, suffocating stench of ozone and impending death. Kala stood completely frozen in the terrified, silent crowd of commoners, her pale, trembling fingers wrapping so tightly around the rusted iron bars that her knuckles completely turned a sickly, translucent white. Every single, agonizing breath she took physically tore at her bruised, exhausted lungs. From her suffocating position behind the heavy security perimeter, she watched the absolute center of her entire universe, her 3-year-old daughter, Lyra, standing entirely alone in the lethal crosshairs of the Solmare execution squad. For 3 brutal, excruciating years, Kala had willingly sentenced hers to a suffocating, invisible hell to prevent this exact, terrifying nightmare. She was never supposed to be a hero, and she was certainly never supposed to be a mother to a royal heir. She was merely a mid-ranking, entirely expendable administrative clerk. 3 years ago, High Counselor Thorne and the corrupt Solmare Council had sent her directly in the secret negotiation chambers with the Alpha King of the Vethkai pack. They firmly, arrogantly believed the Vethkai sovereign was a mindless, bloodthirsty savage. They intentionally sent a low-level, completely disposable female clerk because they fully expected the negotiations to catastrophically fail, entirely prepared to use her inevitable, violent death as the perfect political excuse to resume the brutal border war. But the towering, terrifying Alpha King was absolutely not a mindless savage. He was a brilliant, exhausted, fiercely protective sovereign, desperately seeking peace for his dying people. Over the course of 3 grueling, Isolated months locked completely together in the heavily guarded negotiation chambers. The strict, diplomatic mask violently shattered. They completely stopped performing their rigid political roles. In the quiet, vulnerable margins of the heavily drafted treaties, the ancient, primordial mate bond quietly, beautifully took root. She saved his entire pack with her brilliant administrative mind, and he entirely stole her heavily guarded heart. When the historic peace treaty was finally, successfully ratified, ending years of catastrophic bloodshed, Kala discovered the impossible, terrifying consequence of their secret bond. She was pregnant. Because she was a brilliant administrator, she followed the strict, absolute laws of her pack. She meticulously drafted a formal, highly classified report detailing the mate bond and the royal pregnancy, submit it directly to the Solmir High Council. She foolishly, desperate, believed the council would use the unprecedented bond to permanently solidify the fragile peace treaty. Instead, High Councillor Thorne classified her innocent, unborn child as a catastrophic diplomatic liability. He completely erased her formal administrative rank. He violently seized her modest assets, systematically destroy her professional reputation, and aggressively threatened to execute her in the freezing dark if she ever dared to contact the Vethkai Alpha King. Thorne deliberately, maliciously forced her into the deepest, most toxic slums of the lower rings, condemning the mother of the Vethkai, Heir, to a life of absolute, bone-crushing misery. Kala violently traded her crisp, immaculate administrative uniforms for ragged, stained wool. She spent the last 3 years violently scrubbing the toxic, chemical-soaked floors of the industrial processing plants, breathing in heavy, metallic fumes for 16 agonizing hours a day just to earn a few pathetic copper coins. She willingly starved for entire days at a time, surviving solely on discarded, rotting bread and melted snow, absolute determined to ensure her rapidly growing daughter had a single, warm bowl of thin potato broth. She completely surrendered her name, her brilliant career, and her entire future to become a nameless, exhausted ghost. Have you ever completely sacrificed your own identity, your safety, and your entire future just to silently protect someone who means absolutely everything to you? If you know the exhausting, heavy burden of silently carrying a massive, invisible sacrifice while the entire world believes you are absolute nothing, drop a white rose in the comments below. We absolute see your quiet, unyielding strength, and your beautiful, silent sacrifice will never be forgotten. Resting heavily against Kala's freezing, scarred collarbone, hidden entirely beneath her ragged wool scarf, was her only physical connection to the beautiful, fleeting dream of her past. It was a misshapen, crude pendant of raw, heavy silver. 3 years ago, it was the magnificent, heavily engraved silver fountain pen she had used to personally sign the historic peace treaty. When the corrupt council betrayed her, she had violently held the magnificent pen over a scorching industrial forge, melting the proud, arrogant Solmir crest into an unrecognizable, heavy lump of raw metal. It was the absolute proof of her monumental sacrifice, completely hidden from the cruel, manipulative world. Kala watched the heavy, red laser sights of the pulse rifles aggressively paint the tiny, fragile chest of her daughter, Lyra did not flinch. The tiny girl possessed the exact, terrifyingly calculating eyes of her father and the absolute, unyielding administrative precision of her mother. She was completely indifferent to the terrifying discomfort of the corrupt politicians surround her. But Kala could absolutely not remain indifferent. The heavy, melancholic weight of her lonely, invisible exile immediately evaporated, rapidly replaced by the cold, calculating wrath of a mother pushed entirely to the edge of the abyss. She tightened her calloused, bleeding hands around the rusted iron barricade. The time for absolute, silent suffering was permanently over. The heavy, rusted iron barricade was never designed to withstand the catastrophic, unyielding strength of a desperate mother. Kala did not simply push through the heavy security line. She aggressively, violently tore the reinforced metal completely apart. The sharp, jagged edges of the rusted iron deeply sliced into her pale, calloused palms, but she absolutely did not feel the excruciating pain. She completely ignored the warm blood aggressively dripping down her wrists. She violently shoved past the heavily armed perimeter guards, launching her fragile, exhausted body directly on the cold cobblestones of the central kill zone. Alpha King Kalen possessed the terrifying, unparalleled combat reflexes of a primordial apex predator. He had survived decades of brutal, relentless warfare by instantly neutralizing any sudden, unexpected movement on the battlefield. When he heard the violent metallic screech of the barricade shattering, and the rapid, desperate footsteps sprinting directly toward his location, his massive, heavily muscled body reacted entirely on pure, deadly instinct. He pivoted flawlessly on his heavy combat boots, his heavy, kinetic black armor loudly shifting as he prepared to utterly intercept the foolish, charging threat. He raised his massive, heavily gauntleted hand, completely prepared to violently throw the ragged intruder entirely across the massive plaza before they could even attempt to touch the tiny, 3-year-old girl. But the catastrophic, lethal strike absolute never came. As the desperate, ragged woman aggressively breached the immediate, heavy perimeter of his personal breathing space, the suffocating, ozone-heavy air of the diplomatic square was violently, entirely obliterated. Kalen completely froze. His highly sensitive, dominant biological receptors were aggressively assaulted by intoxicating, hauntingly familiar aroma. It did not smell like the cheap, toxic chemicals of the lower industrial rings, and it absolutely did not smell like fear. It smelled exactly like heavy, expensive parchment, age-black calligraphy ink, and the sharp, undeniable bite of freezing winter rain. It was the absolute exact, unforgettable scent that had entirely consumed his waking mind and his tormented dreams for 3 agonizing years. It was the scent of the brilliant, nameless Solmir administrator who had confidently locked her in a room with a supposed monster, completely outmaneuvered his greatest military generals, and flawlessly drafted the historic treaty that saved his dying empire. The ancient, primordial mate bond, which had been forcefully, unnaturally suppressed by distance and deceit, did not simply awaken. It violently, aggressively exploded inside his broad, heavily armored chest with the catastrophic, concussive force of a direct lightning strike. The severed metaphysical tether rapidly, beautifully regenerated, sending white, hot, agonizing electrical sparks shooting directly his entire central nervous system. The massive, brutal inner wolf completely residing inside his dominant mind let out a deafening, frantic roar of absolute, breathless reverence. The deep, primal purr violently vibrated directly through Kaelin's heavy ribs, physically paralyzing his massive, armored limbs. The absolute, supreme commander of the Vethkai military forces was completely, utterly immobilized by a single breath. Have you ever spent years entirely convinced that the most beautiful, vital piece of your soul was permanently lost in the dark, only to have destiny violently kick the door open and hand them directly back to you? If you know the overwhelming, terrifying shock of finally locking eyes with the exact person you were biologically created to protect, drop a crown in the comments below. We know that true, fated love absolutely can't be permanently erased by corrupt political lies, and the absolute truth will always aggressively hunt down the guilty. Kaelin stumbled a heavy, unbalanced step forward, his striking crimson eyes dilating so wide they appeared completely pitch black. He stared down at the pale, fiercely protective woman who had violently thrown her directly over the tiny girl. Kala completely shielded her daughter with her own fragile, exhausted body, presenting her own ragged back to the 40 heavy pulse rifles aimed directly at them. Her heavy, ragged wool scarf slipped entirely off her bruised collarbone, violently revealing the heavy, misshapen silver pendant resting against her skin. Kaelin recognized the raw, heavy silver. His brilliant, tactical mind instantly reckoned it as the exact, magnificent diplomatic pen she had used to formally sign their treaty, completely melted down and aggressively destroyed to hide its proud, arrogant origin. The horrific, paradigm-shifting realization hit the Alpha King with the devastating, crushing weight of a collapsing mountain. The corrupt, treasonous Solmir High Council had not merely neglected to formally introduce him to the brilliant administrator who saved his pack. They had deliberately, maliciously classified his eternal, fated mate as a severe diplomatic liability. They had aggressively forced the mother of his only biological child to survive in the freezing, toxic slums, intentionally burying his royal bloodline in absolute, bone-crushing poverty. He shifted his desperate, paralyzed gaze from his ragged, exhausted queen down to the tiny, 3-year-old girl peering fearlessly from beneath her mother's protective arms. Lyra possessed his exact, glowing crimson eyes. She possessed his exact, terrifyingly calm demeanor in the face of absolute, catastrophic violence. The almighty Alpha King realized that while he was sitting on a comfortable, gilded throne across the border, frantically searching the continent for a nameless ghost, his brilliant mate had been violently fighting for their survival just a few miles away. The suffocating, heavy silence of the massive Pla Sudden became the absolute loudest, most agonizing sound Kaelin had ever experienced in his entire, immortal existence. The profound, devastating shock violently rewrote his entire biological chemistry. He was no longer a visited diplomat honoring a fragile peace treaty. He was a violently awakened, primordial god of war who had just located his stolen universe. And he was entirely surrounded by the exact, corrupt traitors who had intentionally caused her unimaginable pain. "Fire!" High Counselor Thorn screamed from the elevated marble balcony. His voice echoed violently across the silent plaza. It was harsh. It was arrogant. It was completely entirely devoid of any human empathy. He stared directly down at the ragged, exhausted woman and the tiny child. He saw them as absolutely nothing more than pathetic, disposable political liabilities. He was entirely prepared to execute them to forcefully protect his own corrupt, treasonous empire. The 40 elite Solmare executioners simultaneously tightened their heavily armored fingers against the cold steel triggers of their heavy pulse rifles. But they absolutely never pulled them. The fundamental laws of earthly physics violently surrendered. The world completely broke. Alpha King Kellen did not draw his massive royal broadsword. He did not issue a loud, desperate command. He did not physically strike a single soldier. He simply unleashed his ancient, immortal soul. The ambient air inside the massive plaza instantly crystallized. The temperature violently plummeted completely into absolute zero. Suffocating, apocalyptic gravity rapidly descended directly upon the cold cobblestones. The stagnant air instantly smelled of scorched ozone, burning sulfur, and raw, unfilled cosmic violence. It was not a physical attack. It was pure, flawless, cinematic psychological devastation. The 40 heavy, magically charged pulse rifles simultaneously imploded. The dark, military-grade steel violently crumpled exactly like cheap, discarded tin foil under an invisible, crushing vice. The heavily armored executioners screamed in absolute, breathless terror. Their lethal weapons were effortlessly reduced to useless, jagged dust directly inside their hands. The atmospheric pressure aggressively multiplied. It was immense. It was unstoppable. It physically forced the elite soldiers entirely flat against the freezing cobblestones. They could not breathe. They could not move a single paralyzed muscle. The agonizing, sickening sound of their heavy kinetic armor, loudly cracking under the sheer atmospheric pressure, echoed like rapid gunfire through the massive plaza. There was absolute no blood. There was no unmonetizable, gratuitous gore. There was only the flawless, terrifying application of absolute, ancient supernatural dominance. Kalen stepped flawlessly in front of his fated mate. He completely shielded Kala and his tiny daughter with his massive, heavily armored body. His strike crimson eyes burned with the catastrophic, blinding heat of 1,000 dying suns. He stared directly up at the elevated marble balcony. High Counselor Thorn completely froze. His arrogant, triumphant sneer violently melted off his weathered, wrinkled face. He aggressively grasped the polished marble railing. He frantically gasped for a single breath of oxygen. The invisible alpha aura was a flawless, impenetrable vacuum of death. He suddenly realized the monumental, catastrophic magnitude of his horrific mistake. He had not just ordered the execution of a nameless clerk. He had publicly threatened the true, undeniable queen of the Vethkai Empire directly in front of their apex predator. "You dared to hide her," Kalen whispered. His deep, rumbling voice did not just echo across the massive plaza. It physically vibrated directly into the marrow of the corrupt politicians, violently shaking bones. The concussive, kinetic shockwave of his demonic tone shattered the massive, stained glass windows of the Grand Council Hall entirely into jagged dust. Kalen took a single, thunderous step forward. The heavy cobblestones instantly pulverized completely into fine dust beneath his heavy combat boots. You deliberately classified my eternal soul as a diplomatic liability. He took exactly one more slow, deliberate step. The air aggressively burned. The breathless silence violently screamed. The king did not need a sharp blade. The king was the absolute ultimate weapon. You maliciously forced my queen to violently scrub the toxic floors of your industrial slums. High Counselor Thorne stumbled a desperate, unbalanced step backward. The sheer atmospheric pressure physically compressed his heavy ribcage. My king, Thorne choked out, his voice a pathetic, high-pitched, desperate wheeze. You do not understand the heavy burden. She violated the strict protocols. We were fiercely protecting the peace treaty. We protected your glorious reign. She is the peace treaty, Kalen stated, his voice completely devoid of any recognizable human mercy. Kalen reached out his massive, heavily gauntleted hand. He absolutely did not physically touch the corrupt High Counselor. He simply closed his heavily armored fist in the empty, freezing air. The elevated marble balcony violently exploded. It was not destroyed by explosives. It was completely obliterated by sheer, supernatural kinetic pressure. The heavy marble pillars loudly snapped. The intricate stonework pulverized. High Counselor Thorne screamed as the floor completely vanished beneath his expensive leather boots. He fell violently, crashing heavily on the cold, hard stone steps directly below the ruined balcony. His bones loudly cracked. His political reign of terror permanently ended. He lay completely paralyzed in the freezing rubble. He was entirely broken, completely defeated, and entirely humiliated with a single drop of royal blood being shed. Every single second Thorne remained conscious was an eternity of flawless, meticulously calculated psychological torture. He was finally forced to comprehend the absolute, devastating magnitude of his monumental mistake. Are you as incredibly angry as I am right now? Have you ever watched an arrogant, cruel manipulator suddenly realize they just cornered a sleeping dragon? If you absolutely live to see a vicious tyrant violently put in his place, hit that like button right now to watch this traitor permanently fall. We know that absolute justice is always served to those who maliciously prey on the innocent. The other corrupt council members, trapped on the ruined steps, violently dropped to their knees. They whimpered helplessly. Their highly trained, cold political minds were entirely broken. They were completely, utterly defeated by the absolute, unchecked magnitude of a grieving father's wrath. Kala remained perfect still on the ground behind the towering king. She watched the apex predator of the entire continent systematically dismantle the corrupt Solmir government in less than 60 seconds. The freezing, biting cold of the industrial slums was completely gone. It was replaced entirely by the blistering, overwhelmingly protective heat of his ancient, supernatural aura. It did not burn her. It wrapped secure around her fragile body like a heavy, invincible shield. The tiny, 3-year-old girl completely ignored the terrifying destruction. Lyra stood perfectly calm. She possessed her mother's brilliant, calculating mind. She methodically analyzed the rapidly shifting power dynamics. She watched the corrupt politicians violently fall. She watched the heavily armed soldiers remain completely paralyzed on the ground. She instinctively recognized the unmatched, ancient strength of her true, fiercely protective father. She entirely approved of his aggressive negotiation tactics. Kaelin stood like an immortal god of war amidst the absolute ruins of the Solmir hierarch. He possessed the sheer kinetic power to literally liquefy their organs. He could have violently detonated their hearts with a single, aggressive thought. But Kaelin felt the heavy, glowing crimson eyes of his 3-year-old daughter securely locked onto his broad, heavily armored back. He completely refused to become a mindless, brutal monster directly in front of his newly discovered child. He refused to let his first interaction with his daughter be permanently stained by the sickening stench of actual, physical slaughter. The king possessed absolute, unquestionable power, but he also possessed the strict, ironclad discipline required to perfectly leash it. The suffocating, terrifying storm of the king's wrath finally began to settle. He had completely obliterated the absolute deadliest threat in the entire kingdom without unsheathing his sword. He had left absolutely nothing but pure, unadulterated devastation in his wake. The heavy, suffocating atmospheric pressure slowly evaporated from the ruined plaza, leaving absolute nothing but a deathly, breathless silence in its devastating wake. The thick clouds of pulverized marble and shattered stone finally drifted gently to the cold cobblestones. High Counselor Thorn and his elite execution squad remained completely paralyzed in the rubble, their treasonous reign violently, permanently extinguished by a singular display of unquestionable authority. Alpha King Kaelin did not even spare the broken traitors a second glance. His towering, heavily armored back remained turned to the defeated council. With a slow, deliberate wave of his heavy, gauntleted hand, a thick, magical stasis field locked the corrupt politicians entirely into the ruined stone. They would awaken in the deepest, lightless subterranean cells of the Vethkai prisons, entirely stripped of their noble titles and completely erased from historical existence. The brutal, uncompromising god of war had perfectly executed his terrible wrath. But as Kaelin slowly turned to face the center of the ruined plaza, the terrifying, apocalyptic apex predator completely vanished. He looked directly at Kala, his brilliant, nameless administrator, and his fiercely protective fated mate. She was still kneeling on the freezing cobblestones, completely exhausted, draped in a ragged, stained wool coat, but entirely unbroken. He looked at the massive, calculating 3-year-old girl staring at him with glowing crimson eyes. The sheer, devastating reality of his monumental failure crashed into his broad chest with the catastrophic force of a collapsing star. Kaelin reached up with violently shaking hands. He rapidly unlatched the heavy, dark iron clasps of his royal breastplate. He completely stripped away his heavy, blood-stained kinetic gauntlets, violently tossing the lethal instruments of war directly on the ruined stone. He absolutely refused to touch his fragile, traumatized family with the cold, unforgiving steel of his violent, corrupt world. The almighty Alpha King, the undisputed sovereign of the entire continent, took 3 slow, agonizingly careful steps forward across the ruined plaza. And then, the legendary ruler did the absolute unthinkable directly in front of the entire terrified city. He dropped heavily on his bare knees directly onto the freezing, splintered cobblestones. He bowed his proud, crowned head, completely surrendering his royal dominance, his overwhelming pride, and his entire immortal soul to the ragged woman who had sacrificed absolute everything to save his bloodline. The blistering, oppressive heat of his alpha aura rapidly cooled, seamlessly transforming into a warm, deeply comforting biological blanket. Smelled exactly like a crackling hearth fire, deep forest rain, and overwhelming, desperate love. Have you ever been forced to carry a heavy, invisible burden entirely by yours for so long that you completely forgot what it actually felt like to be held safely? If you know the breathtaking, overwhelming relief of finally being allowed to safely fall apart in the arms of someone who truly sees your immense pain, leave a white dove in the comments below. We know the absolute heaviest armor we ever wear is the silent, exhausting strength we use to aggressively protect our broken hearts. Kellen slow lifted his heavy gaze, his strike crimson eyes, once a cold, impenetrable mask of strict royal authority, were now entirely flooded with heavy, unshed tears. I was completely blind, Kalen whispered, his deep, rumbling voice breaking completely under the crushing weight of his agonizing guilt. I spent 3 brutal years tearing the entire continent apart, frantically searching for the brilliant mind who saved my pack. I never even knew your beautiful name. I let them deliberately hide you in the freezing dark while I sat uselessly on a guild throne. Kala stared down at the crying giant. Her pale, calloused fingers slowly released her tight grip on her daughter. For 3 brutal years, she had meticulously built a fortress of solid ice around her shattered heart. But watching the almighty king weep in the freezing ruins of her miserable prison, the thick, defensive walls violently collapsed. The tiny, 3-year-old girl cautiously stepped entirely out from behind her mother's protective embrace. Lyra slowly approached the towering king, her small bare feet navigating the broken stone with beautiful innocence. Kalen held his breath, absolute in terror that his daughter would instinctively reject the terrifying monster kneeling in the rubble. But the courageous girl reached out a small hand, pressing her warm, tiny palm directly against Kalen's trembling, scarred cheek. A violent, agonizing sob tore directly from the king's throat. Kellen gently wrapped his massive arms around the tiny girl, pulling his daughter tightly against his rapidly beating heart for the very absolute first time. He buried his face in her dark hair, breathing in the precious, undeniable scent of his own royal bloodline. I am so deeply sorry. My beautiful, perfect girl, Kellen choked out, fervently kissing the top of the child's head. I completely missed your first breath. I missed your first words. I swear by the ancient gods, I will spend the rest of my immortal existence earning the absolute right to stand beside you. Kalen Ten shifted his desperate, tear-filled gaze directly up to Kala. He reached out his wide, scarred hand, offering his open palm in absolute, unconditional surrender. My brilliant, unmatched queen, Kellen pleaded, a single tear cutting a clean path down his weathered, exhausted face. Please, tell me exactly how this catastrophic betrayal happened. Tell me your beautiful name. Come back to the light with me. Kalla did not collapse into a weeping, hysterical mess. She slow knelt in the ruined rubble directly across from her fated mate, placing her scarred, pale hand firmly in his massive palm. My name is Kalla, she whispered, her voice a cold, breathtaking melody of absolute triumph. And I did exactly what a brilliant administrator does. He wrote a highly classified, detailed diplomatic report documenting our undeniable bond. I legally filed it with the High Council. High Counselor Thorn completely buried it. He permanently classified our eternal soul as a diplomatic liability to steal your throne. The agonizing ice in her veins permanently melted away, entirely replaced by the undeniable, brilliant fire of the ancient mate bond. She looked at the broken traitors groveling in the dust behind him. She was no longer a nameless, discarded clerk. She was the undisputed sovereign of two massive empires. The grueling, terrifying years of absolute, bone-crushing silence were permanently over. The master negotiator had flawlessly executed her ultimate, triumphant endgame. The heavy, reinforced obsidian doors of the Grand Council Hall were completely shattered, but Kalla did not need a physical room to establish her absolute authority. She stood tall in the center of the ruined plaza, her ragged wool coat slipping entirely from her shoulders as Alpha King Kellen gently wrapped his heavy, fur-lined royal cloak around her fragile frame. 3 brutal years ago, she was a nameless, spendable clerk sent in the dark to die. Today, she was the undisputed, fiercely crowned queen of the Vethkai Empire and the absolute sovereign of the Solmir territory. Kellen stood proudly by her side, his massive, heavily armored frame radiating a dominant, fiercely protective aura that completely shielded his beautiful family. He reached out and gently traced the heavy, melted silver pendant resting against her collarbone. With absolute, breathless reverence, the towering king placed a kiss upon her scarred forehead, silently vowing to fiercely protect her brilliantly calculated reign. The massive crowd of Solmir commoners, who had watched the entire breathtaking spectacle in absolute, terrified silence, immediately dropped to their knees in unquestionable submission. Kalla looked down at the paralyzed, whimpering form of High Counselor Thorn, bleeding pathetically on the freezing cobblestones. The ruined diplomatic pen resting against her chest was no longer a symbol of her agonizing, invisible exile. It was the absolute, undeniable proof of her monumental resilience. She did not raise her voice, and she absolutely did not draw a weapon. She simply looked at her tiny, brilliant 3-year-old daughter, Lyra, who was safely cured in Kalen's massive arms. And then she delivered the final, devastating administrative decree. You maliciously weaponized the law to completely destroy my family, Kalla stated, her voice a cold, flawless melody of absolute triumph. Therefore, you will be permanently erased by it. Your treasonous council is entirely dissolved. Your stolen wealth is completely seized for the lower industrial rings. And your miserable existence is permanently classified as terminated. The most terrifying, devastating weapon in the entire kingdom is never a sharpened broadsword or a mindless, violent army. It is the cold, calculated, unyielding patience of a brilliant mother fiercely protecting her child. When you maliciously force a powerful woman into the freezing dark, you absolutely should not be surprised when she patiently learns to control the terrifying shadows and completely overthrows your corrupt empire. But the subterranean dungeons beneath the Vethkai Mountains are incredibly deep, and high treason demands a terrifying, heavy price. High Counselor Thorn is currently locked in complete, suffocating darkness, anxiously waiting for his final, brutal judgment. What do you think should be his ultimate, agonizing punishment for daring to erase the royal bloodline? Should the brilliant queen execute him publicly in the plaza? Or should she permanently lock him in the toxic industrial slums he forced her to survive in? Let me know exactly how you would serve absolute justice in the comments below. If your heart is still racing from this epic, cinematic power reversal, make sure to hit that like button and share this incredible tale with your fiercely loyal pack. Subscribe to our channel and turn on those notifications, because the glorious reign of this beautiful, dangerous family has only just begun.